Okay, thank you much, everybody. We're going into our next panel session, and that is the unexpected business of identity. I'm joined by my esteemed panelists. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, first of all, just for a couple of minutes, and just give their views on, why they're here, why they've got, something that perhaps, people would see as perhaps an alternative view or an alternative solution to identity. So I'm going to go to you, Louie.
Hi there, I'm Louie Gasparini. I am an EIR, Entrepreneur in Residence with BBVA. I've been involved in identity on the internet since there was identity on the internet. I built the first online banking system at Wells Fargo in 1996, and so I've been in this area ever since. Joined BBVA looking at identity. What does it mean? Where is it going? My view of identity is that it was something I remember when I met Scott Cook, who founded Intuit some years back. He asked, why did Intuit win out over the banks, where the banks have, the ability, they were building home banking systems back then, but this little company Intuit came and won all the consumers. Why? He said, because the banks forgot the consumer. They built a system where you could see your DDA account and your banking account. They built it with a bank perspective, and he forgot the consumer. And I think that's what's needed in identity. As we roll out new identity solutions, I think we need to remember the consumer. The consumer's got to be involved. And I think we're going to see more of, in the last talk you heard about user-centric, self-sovereign identities. I think identities that are more in control of the user. And I think that's where the world is going.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Greenwell. I'm the CEO of Danal Inc. And I'm also a former military intelligence officer, got out of the Army in 1991. And I remember back then, we wanted to hide all our identity. We didn't want anybody to know much about us, and it's a different world today. And of course, there are a number of challenges on the commercial side, even the government side. We heard a great presentation earlier about a very comprehensive approach to identity. And it's interesting, from our perspective, I don't think there is a clear answer to going forward. It's sort of like an airplane that takes off and has a destination in mind. It's going to be off course 95% of the time, but eventually it's going to be cajoled and pushed in the right direction, and we will get there. And I think it's probably going to be a combination of different types of authoritative sources. Certainly from our perspective, we believe the MNOs, the network operators, are going to play a very important role, and we're partnering with them, but so are other. I don't think there's a single comprehensive solution, but there'll be solutions that are put together. And the customers are going to decide what wins ultimately. And I think a large influence on the customers will be what enterprises and other entities will do. So happy to be here.
Ranjita Iyer from Mastercard, working in the Identity Solutions Group, driving product strategy and innovation. And from my perspective, Mastercard has really always been in the business of identity for several years. So at that moment when you're making the transaction happen, knowing who that person is and authenticating them is critical, and it has been a critical part of our business for maybe the good part of 10 years. And so when we think about identity, we think about the transaction. That's the first thing. In the physical world, that was easier, right? So if you look at approval rates for transactions, they're about 96% or so for the physical transactions. But in the digital world, that drops to about 83%. So now in the digital world, there's so many more vectors, more dimensions, things that we need to think about. So we'll continue to invest in that space in terms of knowing who that person is at the moment of truth. So that's one thing related to transactions. The other aspect of identity that we're really focused on is financial inclusion. And that's a huge initiative for Mastercard, has been for several years. And we've partnered with many governments, such as the Nigerian government and others, to enable their national IDs themselves. And many times those IDs are also a payment card. So we're really looking at it from both those angles, and now with the whole advent of digital, IoT, connected devices, bringing all that into what identity means for us in the digital world is what we're kind of focused on today.
Hello, everybody. I'm Will Lankston. I'm head of identity at Timpson. Timpson is a family-owned business in the UK. We are shoe repairers. and key cutters. So I feel a little bit out of place on this stage with all these tech experts. We got involved in ID because we think there's a market here to assist at some point in this journey with people getting or maintaining digital identities. We know that lots and lots of cases and lots of these transactions can happen online, purely online, and lots of people will be able to get through that system. But actually, we also recognize that there's a group of people who will struggle to do this stuff online. They won't be able to get verified purely off their online data. And we think we might be able to help fill that gap. We operate through 1,900 shops in the UK. That's an area about the same size as Michigan. So we've got lots and lots of shops filled with lots of great people. And we're coming at this from a different angle. We don't actually know kind of how it's going to work yet, but we do think that we can add value to this ecosystem somehow.
Okay, thanks very much. So I'm going to go back to Will on my next question, just because I think people in the audience might want to hear a little bit more about why a shoe repairer is here on this stage with us. There's lots of models around the world towards identity, but often I think people expect, and those models do come out of either government or financial services. We've talked about the models in Sweden, ADHAR, those types of models, they tend to come out of those places. So I think some people expect government or financial services to be, the keepers or providers of identity. Do you agree or disagree with that approach? And if you, either which way, why do you think that? So I'm going to go back to Will first of all.
I don't think we necessarily agree or disagree, which is kind of an escape from the question. My view on kind of who's going to be the keeper of this stuff, it's very clear. The most important thing is that we find somebody who can be trusted, an organization that can be trusted. Now, we believe that we are trusted. We cut the most keys, your house keys. We cut the most keys in the UK every single day. And that's why we feel that we've got an inherent trust with our customers. We also know that banks and financial institutions don't necessarily have that. We all know that people love to bash the bankers. And I think that there needs to be a brand or a trusted organization to come into this ecosystem to really allow customers to feel comfortable. And I think that's really, really important. I'm not saying that it won't necessarily be a bank. I think some of the new challenger banks could definitely play a part in this ecosystem. But people seem to be a bit disheartened and disillusioned with the incumbent banks. So I don't know how it will go, but I know that for it to work, the keeper is definitely going to have to be a trusted organization.
Okay, so I'm going to ask that question to Louie. People like to bash the banks. What do you think?
Well, I think, the question is who's going to be the trusted issuer of identities? And I think the answer is everybody. I mean, lots of factors. Today in my wallet, I've got a driver's license, I've got a credit card, I got a bank debit card, I got a health card, I got insurance cards. I've got loads of different identities. I have a lot of identities today. And I think in the future, I'll have the same. There'll be electronic identities. And I think the user will be the one in charge. The banks need to trust, the user needs to trust somebody that's going to give them an identity and that they can reuse it. In the panel before this, they talked about double blind and triple blind, where I could apply for unemployment and my bank doesn't need to know that I'm applying for unemployment, and the unemployment office doesn't need to know I have a bank with BBVA. But they just need to know that I am who I am. So we need a facility that will facilitate this, allow the user to securely manage, store, and control these identities the same way they have them in their wallet, and be accepted at different places. So I think there'll be multiple players in this ecosystem.
Okay. Ranjita?
Sure. So I think I kind of agree with Louie. I think that there's going to have to be some kind of a hybrid model. It's not that it's just the governments. If it's just the governments, it's going to be a very centralized system that may not be useful for the citizens at large, right? So if it's just the banks, they obviously have financial data and people trust them in a way to provide them, to be the keepers of that financial data, but that's about it. But there's also the social giants that we have to think about, right? The Facebooks and the LinkedIns of the world and the Googles. How are they going to play in this ecosystem? And I think they have something valuable as well. They have the mass of consumers. Plus, I mean, they're not verified IDs by any means, but they are a social graph, and there are fintechs in this space that are trying to monetize that. So I think it's going to be a come together of various different parties that might all participate in providing the ID. And then the other thing we really need to think about is the acceptance of that ID, right? So there's no point in creating IDs if people aren't accepting it. So we need to think about the provider. So if you think about Mastercard from a network perspective, that's what we've been doing for our 50-year history, right? So we have somebody that's providing something. So it's a bank providing a card, and then we have acceptance. We have millions of merchants that accept them. So I think that getting that right is critical for digital identity to be successful.
So to be clear, an authoritative source for identity exists. 30 years ago, you think about it, you go to a bank with a form of identity, probably from the government, and in most developed countries, it exists. I think what we're talking about here is the digital identity. And more we think the mobile device, obviously the device associated with identity is going to become more important. But an authoritative source already exists. It's verifying that that digital identity is somehow attached or verified that it's attached to the actual identity. And that's where all the nuances come in. So agreed that it'll be a hybrid approach, but authoritative sources exist. It's transcoding or transplanting that to the digital world. Okay. Specifically, in our view, the mobile world.
Okay, so we're going to have lots of different players, all kind of providing different solutions into the kind of market space, and I think a lot of people talk about that as this kind of identity ecosystem. Now, I guess from my perspective, I kind of sit here and go, well, that sounds great, but actually, I would like to have an identity that, I can take across borders. I'd like to be able to go from the UK and move to San Francisco and be able to open bank accounts with my identity. So I think, if you kind of start to think about that type of, slightly more complex use case, we have to start thinking about, how do we get to some kind of level of interoperability? Now, I guess, if we look at like the payment networks and payment schemes, they've, done something around that, similar to that with payments. So I'm kind of interested to know, do you think, or how do you think we get to some kind of level of interoperability with identity? And I'm going to go to Ranjita because she is from Mastercard.
Sure. So I think what we're seeing, and I was in a panel earlier this morning, I believe, where they were talking about several governments and their individual schemes, right? So governments, they tend to be nationalistic at best with their identity schemes, but they are the ones that are out there today, for better or for worse. And some of the standards that they, some of these identity schemes are based on, they are thinking about interoperability, right? So NIST is trying to work with the regulation in the UK and others. So they're starting to think about that, but the interoperability question is huge. That's why we love Mastercard and Visa, right? So you pull out your Mastercard and you're able to use it anywhere, no matter where you are. And that's the kind of utopia that you're talking about. And I think that's something that we all have to strive to think about as we come up with a scheme for digital identity that can be ubiquitous, that can be everywhere. So I think that's something that has to be really addressed, and I'm not saying we have an answer yet, but it definitely requires the cooperation of various different parties for that very reason.
Okay, Will, go on, Louie.
Well, just real quick. I mean, I would add that today it's not that simple to move from one country to another and get your identity ported. So, for example, if you're in the EU and you move here to the US, well, there's no TransUnion Equifax credit check facility. I can't check your identity. If you want to open a credit card here today, in most cases, if you're a millionaire in the EU, you've still got to give $500 to get $500 credit on a credit card here in the US because they don't know who you are. So it's not that portable today. I think what we need to do is get the standards in place to transport these identities, these electronic identities across borders, and then create the agreements that created Mastercard and credit card, because how did that work? Well, you got the merchants and the banks agreeing that they would pay. There was a contract put in place. So we've got to start forging these roads, and it's exciting. It's an exciting spot that we're at, but we're still in those early stages.
Yeah.
And transport standards for how to transport the identities, forge the roads, the contracts, the liability, and the format of the identities are going to be key.
Okay, so it doesn't sound like it's a technology issue. Doesn't sound like blockchain is going to solve it anyway.
Blockchain is the answer to blockchain is the answer to everything, right?
Jim, go on.
Sure. So if you rewind about 20 years ago, if I was on a Verizon phone, one of our great partners, and I wanted to send a text perhaps to Ranjita or anybody overseas, you couldn't do it until an agreement was placed between the operators, and there was a lot of third-party aggregators that did that. Now, that's sort of a simple model for interoperability, right? GSMA technology, I might transcode into CDMA, may be able to send it over a certain signaling system, et cetera. We talked about the Mastercard, you're containing PII, a lot of sensitive information. So we're expanding globally with MNOs, and right now it's not a technology question. The technology is there. It's more one of privacy. We see, for example, laws in Germany that are very tough, very prohibitive, but they're moving slowly. The glacier is melting. Germany in particular is a very tough market, but we're also working with innovative MNOs like Orange, that is not only an MNO, but now they're getting into digital banking. You talk about two highly regulated industries. I think you're going to see more of that. I think you're going to see more of that innovation and that, that hesitancy to do things, especially with large institutions because of compliance issues, are going to start to be challenged as the new ecosystem starts to evolve, my perspective.
Okay, cool. Will?
I agree with Louie on well, all of you actually, but I think the point that Louie made in that, it's very, very early days yet. I think we just need to be careful in that we don't hang around too long thinking about interoperability, and we need to make sure that this works with this country's system. We need to make sure it works with that country's system. We've got to keep motoring. Everybody's got to keep moving forward, and then let's kind of, as we get there, let's figure it out. Because we run that risk if we sit and we wait for people to come up with standards. We want to make sure that we've got a body kind of overseeing the interoperability, that nothing will happen. Innovation is kind of the best way forward. It always reminds me of the space race, actually, this. You see the US and Russia kind of challenging, and as soon as someone starts moving a bit quicker than the other, everyone tries to catch up. So I just think that each country needs to keep pushing forward with their own solution, because everyone's got their local challenges and different things that they're facing, and that will push the interoperability game forward.
Okay, cool. So we've got some different answers there. Louis sort of talking about standards and frameworks, and Will saying, let's just innovate and kind of move these forward. So I just want to go back to one of the points that I think Jim made, just around liability. So you're all kind of bringing new solutions to the marketplace and in identity, and that doesn't, those don't necessarily sit with your traditional models. Will at the end there is, on a different spectrum, from kind of shoe repairer to identity provider. So we're kind of, and Louis here is kind of moving out of financial services, so that might be a little bit more expected. But I'm interested to know, in your view, about any changes in terms of risk and liability in that context, in terms of your businesses. So I'll go to Louis first.
Sure. Again, I think the liability question comes down to, who's the issuer, and then from the acquirer, what can they sue the issuer of the identity if there's a problem? Well, if you use your driver's license today and somebody steals it and forges it and then uses my driver's license, the recipient cannot sue the government. The person's sort of on their own with respect to that. I think identity is going to be somewhat similar. I mean, the way I see it, whoever's issues an identity is going to do it in a certain way. I would think that would be part of the identity itself, or a reference from the identity itself. I did this to issue the identity. And sure, I did this and I performed this, and I should guarantee I perform that. Now, whether or not the person gave me the right information to perform it on, and something happened, there was fraud around it, well, that exists today, I can't control that. So it's sort of as is. So I think you're gonna have these as is type identities. I give it to you, here's how it was issued, here's the steps that went through, you make the decision as the acquirer if you want to acquire it. And if you're gonna make your own decision independent of that, you still gotta go through the same steps and make your decision anyway. So I think it becomes very comparable to what exists today.
Okay, so you don't think it's an exciting thing for the lawyers right just yet?
Not unless somebody wants to guarantee a couple $1 million for an identity, which I don't think you can today. I mean, I think even if you're doing it for yourself, there's a risk. And that's just the nature of what it is.
Okay, cool. How about you, Ranjita? What do you think?
Liability is an important issue, right? So Mastercard, as you know, we don't hold any PII. So all we hold are PAN numbers or tokens for a card, and the actual PII is really stored by the banks, which is the entity that issues you your card. So for us getting into the identity business, that's something that we have to really think about. Maybe the double blind and the triple blind, of having that. And I have to really understand how that works. But if we can come up with a scheme that way whereby nobody is really the holder of the PII, maybe some of the identity providers, but then there's a network that's able to obfuscate that to some extent, I think that's an interesting model to kind of think about as we think about liability. But then again, it goes back to your question of who do you sue, right?
I mean, that's who holds the PII. Then the question is who issued the identity. So there's two things, PII and identity. I think PII should be blind and the consumer should be in charge. An identity, who issued it, well, that's the issuer, and that's what I just said before.
That's the person that issues it.
Okay. What do you think, Jim?
Well, liability is not an issue until it becomes an issue, right? But bar none, in all of our contracts, indemnification, the liability component becomes the most contentious because it is kind of nebulous. There's, we're doing some innovative things with the G&D in Germany, Morpho as well. And, in Europe specifically, they have a lot of the underlying technology behind identity cards, and we're using the M&O, the device, to help authenticate the information, and of course G&D and Morpho are looking at the underlying paper that it was written on. So where does the liability exist? Ultimately, we think that the person engaged with the consumer has the frontline liability piece, however that may be, and then everything else are layers, and that's probably how it's going to pan out.
Same thing, the acquirer.
The acquirer.
Okay, what do you think, Will?
This is an interesting one for us. We get asked this question a lot, kind of what happens if it goes wrong? So what happens if you verify someone's attributes and it all goes wrong? It becomes even more interesting when you take into account that we're the biggest employer of ex-offenders in the UK, so ex-cons. I can see the faces kind of looking at me like I must be crazy. So I think what's really important here is that we take a common sense approach. Again, we shouldn't let liability be a blocker. Obviously, we need to make sure that we've got a secure system and that we can take every step and you can really get down and see where the problems occurred. But I think, again, we run the risk of, oh, God, who do I sue? What if I can't sue someone? Well, then, you could end up, no one's going to want to get involved in this system. In the UK, we've got some legislation about to come out that we were talking about earlier to do with adult content. So the UK government has said that all adult content providers in the UK will have to age verify their customers. But no one wants to get involved. I mean, go to a bank and say, hey, will you verify people so they can watch porn? As you can imagine, not that many people are interested. And then especially when you add in, well, can you verify people so they can watch porn? And if it goes wrong and you let a child watch porn, we're going to come down on you like a ton of bricks. So I just think we need to take a common sense approach. We need to make sure that we're not delving too deep in this. And also, companies should be allowed to play in a sort of safe space, in a sandbox, so that they can make those mistakes in a safe environment, and then we can work out the best way forward.
Thanks, Will. So I was just going to go to some questions from the audience. Has anyone got any questions? Mr. Burge.
Identity, a bank identity, a sports identity that we can use
So Dave's asking, there isn't the expertise. Yes, so Dave's question is the challenge that we haven't solved identity yet, is that just a fundamental lack of understanding within the banks?
I think there's a bit of that, Dave. And maybe we've talked about this as well before, but I think there is some of that. Obviously the banks are doing what they're doing every day, day in, day out. There's obviously a huge digital identity opportunity there, but they're not grabbing it, they're not taking it. That's what you're seeing, right? So I think there is a bit of that there, is that has never been the core. There never been, for example, just their KYC data, right? So banks they're sitting on tons of KYC data, and regulation is favorable for KYC file from one bank to be used by another bank. But yet, till today, that is just sitting there as a cost. It's a sunk cost. They have not been able to monetize it, whereas you would think that if they were able to put it on a network so that it can be interoperable and so that it can be used in a persistent way by citizens, that they should do that and take that opportunity to monetize it, but they haven't done that for years. So I think there is a bit of that, so I totally do agree with you, but hopefully, with forums like this and others, and with us getting into the digital world, hopefully that will change, and I think it'll be very different in 10 years' time.
I actually think the problem is the inverse. I think banks and institutions have a very good understanding. I think what the challenge is, and we see it a lot, we did a bake-off about 18 months ago with a major data provider. They tested M&O data, and we, quote-unquote, won. We still haven't launched. And it's because they do understand it so well. So we've had to go through an InfoSec. They have to look at all the security requirements around it. They had a contract negotiate, which took about 8 months. And then there's implementation, there's testing. I think there's a very strong knowledge. I think there's still uncertainty about what the definitive solution will be, but I think a lot of institutions are testing and finding out what's out there. My perspective.
I totally agree with both. We're on the cusp of some new things happening in identity, and it's about time. I mean, Dave, you know this. You've been in this a while. We've been in this a while. But people are now asking the tough questions. Who's liable? How are the rails? How do we do this? What's interoperable? What is the standards? Is it blockchain? Is it in one spot so it can be attacked? Is it distributed? Is the user in control? But these are good questions, and they're starting to get answered. And I think very soon you're starting to right now with Canada and with the session before. Had a great discussion, if you weren't at it, about what's going on in Canada, Bank ID in Norway and UK Verify. I think you're seeing more activity in the space right now, and I think it's going to get better and easier for the user to use. And what we need is more people to accept it, and that's the last mile, so to speak. Get the acquirers to accept this, and I think the time is coming.
Will, have you got any comments to that?
I guess we're in a unique situation that we kind of look at this from the outside in. We're not sort of super tech experts who are paving the way forward. From our perspective, I think what we do see a little bit of, and it's a shame, is some organizations take a bit of a protectionist approach. So some people are kind of trying to, what it seems to us is really protect their interests. And I think at times that has slowed things down. I think things could have probably moved a bit quicker if organizations had really seen the value in the future and not necessarily tried to kind of look after their past interests.
Okay. We've got any more questions? We've got another one just over there. There's the microphone just behind you, actually, if you want to go and stand at the mic.
Yeah, I just want to push you guys a little bit on the liability issue, because I think it's a really important thing. I mean, I used to, before I worked in identity, I worked in, I sold servers for a living, and it was a very accepted part of that industry that if the server broke down, the company wasn't going to sue you for their entire loss of business because their networks were. But in the identity space, that's not a given. Everyone seems to want an ironclad guarantee. And what I try to do is put that in terms of financial trade-off, right? Okay, you could pay for insurance, but the amount you're going to pay for that, per user is so much more than the loss on the other side of a minute number of people. So I just want to push you guys a little bit more to how, when you talk to your customers, how do you phrase that? How do you explain to them the trade-offs and in order for them to see your perspective and gain more acceptance?
I could answer just briefly. So we can guarantee 100% confidence in the data. We doubt that you'll get very many qualified prospects or data sets, but you can guarantee it. It just becomes so, so frictionful that it's not meaningful. So that's the trade-off. So when we talk to our customers, it's about, hey, here are all the signs of whether this is good data or if there are any, red flags that you should be aware of. So we have scoring systems that we give. So if liability is going to be high on our part, then we'll just flag everything. And that's not what the customer wants ultimately. So it's that balance, right? And that's the conversation we ultimately wind up having. Unfortunately, it's over a 6-month period, but that's the conversation that goes pretty deep. So servers are slightly different, right? They either work or they don't. With data, it can be complicated.
Yeah, and I agree. I think, you'll see levels of identity vetting. So for example, if I go into one of the stores that Will has over there, an in-person interview, well, perhaps that's better than just answering some secret questions over the internet or just giving my bank login, which is phishable in a lot of cases, right? So if I want an in-person interview or notarized identity, maybe I have a higher level of assurance, and maybe there's more insurance there. I don't know. The insurance number, the liability number, you've got to take in balance. Sure, I want $1 million liability, but if I can't cover that because the vetting wasn't high enough, my choice is I could do it myself. So what do I want to do? I can accept the lower liability, or I can do my own vetting. And companies are going to have to make those decisions. And hopefully we've got a solution in place that's good enough and better than what it is today. And as Will says, we want to all move the ball forward. We just want to improve things. Let's get it better than it is today. We'll bootstrap it more as we go forward.
I'll take $1 million liability policy.
Anyone else? No? Has anyone else got any more questions? I've got another one over there.
Going back to Dave's question, I think there is some movement by banks. So Capital One just released a beta API. So instead of using Google or Facebook to OAuth your identity, your utility company can vet you through your bank. So that, just knowing you're talking about KYC, I think there's an inherent value for a bank to let others know that this customer is real. And they don't need to really know much more than that. And for the bank, there's the inherent value of establishing trust. So you've got trust for money, and then you get trust for identity, and then all business flows from trust and identity. So I think banks are moving in that direction despite Wreck Kings breaking banks.
The trust with banks, though, occurs because they don't, there's data providers that don't necessarily charge a transaction cost, but they are able to utilize the data to monetize. Banks don't typically do that. They won't sell your data. They won't. But as I think we saw at TD Bank, SVP said that transactional volumes, margins, and revenues are going down. So what do we do with the data, which has some inherent value? And I think that's going to be the challenge if you fast forward 20 years now for financial institutions.
Okay. So I think what we're hearing is that, there's certain organizations, some of the banks and other organizations who are going, actually, we want to tackle some of these gnarly issues, some of the issues around liability. We want to, kind of embrace this thing about identity. And perhaps some organizations will decide that they just don't want to touch identity at all. For certain organizations, it's part of what they do, but only because they have to do it, because they're regulated to do it. But, if you look at banks, they actually just want to provide financial services products. They don't necessarily want to do identity. So I'm wondering the panel's view on, the future of how they think the market might roll out. Can you imagine a future whereby we have a whole sort of subset of organizations that, are from lots of different industries, from the telcos, from the banks, perhaps from retailers, and perhaps organizations that want to take some of those high-risk transactions that will do identity, and then those that will step back. Do you imagine that's part of the future, or do you think we'll stay with the status quo, where there's some that kind of do both, and then some that kind of step into that space?
I think there are some industries that are critical, right? So there's the governments, there's the financial institutions, there's the MNOs, there's the digital giants, and maybe one or two others that would want to play in this space directly in terms of identity. But there are going to be others that are just going to be acceptors and users of it. right? So, and we need that ecosystem for it to really work. So I think there's going to be these providers of identity, and they're going to be one of these people that I just mentioned. And then there's going to be a ton of other service providers that are just providing digital services to consumers and getting the mass into that digital identity ecosystem. And they're probably going to stay out of it and participate by just accepting the identity. And I think that's how it will eventually play out.
Okay.
I think I would answer your question with a question in a way. I mean, what I'd be really interested to see is obviously, as you said, the financial institutions, and some of them are playing in this space purely because they have to. But actually their real product is financial services, right? I'll be really interested to see in a few years' time some of these startups and organizations that are wholly focused on offering identity services, and that is their core product. Are they offering a better solution, or is it the banks? I think that's going to be an interesting thing to see.
Okay, anyone else?
No, I agree with that. I think identity solutions will morph as we move forward. I don't know. That's it.
So I guess my kind of final question, and then I will open up the floor for one last question. So you're all from, I guess, different sectors. And we touched on earlier on, what the consumer is thinking about all of this, because we've talked about, what our kind of respective businesses think about it. So I always kind of use my mum as my use case, so my mum's 70-something. And, when I kind of talk to her about different parts of identity, I mean, for example, one of the banks in the UK rolled out facial biometric, and I kind of had a conversation with my mum about it, and she said, well, no, I think that it should be iris because I think that's more secure. Not founded in any grounded or any kind of reality whatsoever, So she didn't think that facial was going to be secure for whatever reason, but it meant that she wouldn't use it. So I'm kind of interested, using my mum or, kind of consumer edge case, what you think about, what will she think about, mobile? Will she think that, it needs to be a bank? Will she want to go into a Timpson store because it's a retail store and it's local? What do you think about, somebody sort of in their 70s and their view on identity?
I love the metaphor. Does she have a mobile phone?
She does, but she never answers it.
So most people in the world have a mobile phone. I imagine she's had a pretty good experience with it, and that's where we're basing, sort of our identity. And I'm sure she would find it helpful. But
so you think it's going to go mobile?
I think most digital identities are going mobile, and I think it's going to only increase.
Okay.
But the consumer, I mean, I don't want to downplay that. The consumer, I think it's so important. Getting it right, getting it easy for the consumer to use and intuitive. They don't know about assurance levels, and they don't want to deal with all that. They just want to access a service, and they want to access it easily when they want it, where they want it, and I think, and safely. So giving them a service that is putting the consumer in the middle of that is really going to be the key to success. So I think that's very important. But I'm very impressed that she was able to differentiate between facial and iris. So.
I would just quickly add, there's two things. There's identity and there's authentication. So the identity, will be issued by many issuers, as we've said, banks, government, health, enterprise, travel, whatever. Loads of people issue identities. Where they're stored and how the user controls it comes down to this. Everybody has one, you lose it. Somebody said earlier, if I lose my wallet, I'm going to call my credit card. I'm going to go do that immediately. You lose your phone, you're going to care right away. You're going to want to make sure that nothing can happen with stuff that might have been on the phone. But it's very secure nowadays. With fingerprint, look what's happening with Apple and the San Bernardino terrorists. They couldn't get in the phone. These things are very secure nowadays. So having this to control your identities and encrypt your information, that's your authentication. So identities will be issued by various issuers. Authentication, I think, will be in control of the user based upon devices that they have. And then we just need to re-provision them on new devices.
And always have iris.
Iris is, your mom is right, by the way. Iris is better than facial.
She is right. It was a good guess. Go on, have you got a question?
Yeah, I have a comment, but first I have to respond to something because I'm a biometrics market analyst. The fingerprint on your mobile phone is not security, it's convenience. There are no those fingerprints are not hardened security on mobile phones. I think it's really important that people understand that. Because all you need is
when you're done, I'd like to comment on that.
You need a 4 or 6 passcode PIN to get around it. So,
My mum knows.
you know, and I'm glad your mother knows that because I read a lot of articles online where people clearly don't. So your mom has more info than a lot of the people that are writing online. The comment I want to make actually isn't related to that. As I'm sitting here listening to this, the conversations about identity, and listening to you guys talk about financial institutions, and you're from Mastercard, and we're talking about the big digital companies. I've been in this in the high-tech space for 30 years, and I've watched big companies come, and I've watched them go. And I wonder if a lot of the conversations we're having right now, and this is just to put out there for thoughts, I don't know the answer, if the conversation and the solutions are being driven by the existing big players, whether those be tech players or financial services. And I wonder if we are missing the actual future of this technology because we're trying to fit it into models of business and infrastructures and ecosystems that exist to serve these large established corporations. And I just wonder if what we're going to end up with is going to be something radically different that has no relationship to the way that we currently organize and monetize these other services.
It's an intriguing question. You know, we haven't talked about healthcare and other, you know, segments or areas that that may need identity. But I think at the end of the day, certainly from a Silicon Valley-based company, we're economic animals, right? We're going to go where we think is going to be the most rewarding financially. And of course, you have a duty to make sure, especially when you're dealing with data and identity, not to just let that be the primary driver. It is also, you know, concurrent with integrity and doing all the right things when it comes to security, because there are some legal ramifications to it all. But it's an intriguing question. The short answer is we don't know, but we are driven by market dynamics for sure and what the consumer seems to want. Sometimes it's guesswork, but we do a lot of education and we take a lot of feedback from the market and incorporate it with what we do. But it's an intriguing proposition you bring up.
I think the biggest problem is that the model hasn't been figured out, period. Not whether or not it's the big player or the small player or the whatever player. I think it's just what is the model? What is the business model that's going to work here? And I think that like I'm working at a large bank, but they're looking to spin up something new to experiment here. So I think you do see a willingness to look at things from different angles. But I think the biggest problem is, what is the model? What is the business model? What's the legal model? What are the Rails model? How do you get this thing deployed? How does it work? And as I said earlier, I think it's not one winner. I think there'll be multiple issuers of identity. I think it should be user-centric. The user's in control and in complete charge of what they have and how they use it. And so I think you're going to be seeing a shift towards that. I got to say one comment about your fingerprint, though. Fingerprints are pretty on iPhone. I can tell after you register at my service, I can tell if you've changed your fingerprint. So if you've added somebody else or if you've changed it, I can tell.
That, but the bottom line security for the phone is a PIN still.
I'm not, okay.
So I think it just
there's more,
confuses
there's
people.
more, there's more. I can tell if you've changed it. I can also tell that you are using I could force you to use a fingerprint and not a PIN. So I could shut those down programmatically. I can say you must use a fingerprint, and I can say it must be the same fingerprint that you registered with me, or the same set of fingerprints at the time you registered with me.
Yeah, and that's application specific. I'm just saying to put out a statement that our phones are secure because we have fingerprint sensors on. That's all I was reacting.
I'll hear you there. Let me clarify that statement then. With the right application, I think these things are very secure, and they're very good, and I think we'll be seeing, and it has the best balance of security and convenience. And you put some risk analytics on it and some things I just talked about to check if things have changed. I think it's the best way to go that we have today. Other than that, you're going to be putting an iris and naming an iris, a camera at your iris every day.
I'm a big proponent of biometrics. I'm not trying to discourage it. I'm just saying that those kind of gross statements, I think, can be misconstrued, and then people really don't understand what's going on.
Yeah, with application-specific help, they could become very strong.
Okay, we've actually run out of time. So if anyone's got any more questions, please feel free to come and grab any of the audience members. I just wanted to say the Unexpected Business of Identity panel, thank you very much. Will, Jim, Louie, and Ranjita, thank you very much.
Thank you.